The first cow was found just before sunrise, lying in the far field where the fog never seemed to lift. No blood, no tracks, no signs of struggle. Its eyes were open, glassy, staring at something only it had seen. By the end of that week, 3 more animals would die the same way, and by the time people realized the farm itself was watching, it was already too late to leave. The strange deaths would come later, long after anyone thought to question the land or the silence around it. Before that, before the animals and the fog and the quiet that felt too deliberate, there was only a man trying to outrun a life that had collapsed faster than he could understand. His name was Daniel Harper, and until a year earlier, he had believed himself ordinary in the most comforting way. He had lived in a small rented house on the edge of a town in western Pennsylvania, close enough to the city to commute, far enough to feel removed from it. He worked maintenance for a manufacturing plant, the kind of job that paid just enough to keep things stable as long as nothing went wrong. For a long time, nothing did. He was married, no children, routine days that blended into one another, evenings spent repairing things that didn't really need fixing just to keep his hands busy. That life ended quietly, the way most real endings do, without shouting or slammed doors. His wife fell in love with someone else. She told him over dinner, apologetic in a way that made it worse. Within months, the house was empty, the furniture divided, the silence unbearable. The divorce drained what little savings he had, legal fees stacking up faster than he expected. And when the plant announced layoffs shortly after, Daniel found himself holding a severance check that barely covered 3 months of rent. He tried to stay where he was. He took temporary jobs, night shifts, delivery work, anything that paid immediately. But the town felt smaller every day, filled with reminders of a version of himself that no longer existed. The house felt like a shell. Sleep became difficult. He stayed up late scrolling through his phone, searching for jobs he was barely qualified for, places he had never considered living. That was when he found the listing. It wasn't flashy, no photos, just text on a plain page buried deep in a rural employment forum. Farmhand needed. Livestock experience preferred but not required. Housing provided. Weekly pay. Location listed only as a rural county in upstate New York, close enough to reach by train. The pay wasn't great, but it was steady, and the promise of housing was what caught his attention. Daniel had grown up around farms, helped his uncle during summers as a teenager, knew enough not to romanticize the work, but not enough to fear it either. More than anything, the job represented distance. Distance from his ex-wife, from the plant, from the version of himself who had failed to hold things together. He read the listing over and over that night, imagining quiet mornings, physical labor that left him too tired to overthink, nights where sleep came without effort. He sent an email before he could talk himself out of it. The reply came the next morning, short, direct. The owner thanked him for his interest, asked a few basic questions, and offered the position starting the following week. No interview, no background check. Something about that should have concerned him, but desperation has a way of dulling instincts. Daniel sold what little furniture he hadn't already lost, packed his clothes into 2 bags, and left the keys on the kitchen counter of a house that no longer felt like his. When the train pulled out of the station, he watched the town disappear, without nostalgia. He told himself this was temporary, a reset, a place to breathe. At no point did he consider why a farm with land and livestock would be so eager to hire strangers, or why the ad had been reposted so many times over the past year. Those details existed, quietly waiting, the way warnings often do, visible only in hindsight. The train ride north took longer than Daniel expected, the kind of journey where stations became fewer and farther apart until the names stopped sounding familiar at all. Outside the window, the scenery shifted gradually from crowded towns to wide stretches of land broken only by trees and distant barns. The sky felt larger here, lower somehow, pressing down on the fields instead of stretching upward. When the train finally slowed, the platform was little more than a concrete strip beside the tracks. No station building, no crowds, just one flickering light and a wooden bench worn smooth by decades of use. Daniel stepped off with his bags and stood there for a moment, listening to the train pull away, the sound fading faster than he expected, leaving behind a silence that felt unfinished. A pickup truck waited near the road, engine idling. A man leaned against it, older than Daniel by at least 20 years, broad-shouldered, face lined by sun and work rather than age. He didn't introduce himself at first, just nodded toward the bags and said Daniel's name like a statement, not a question. The drive to the farm took nearly 40 minutes along narrow roads that twisted through forest and open land. Daniel watched the trees grow denser, the houses disappear entirely. When the farm finally came into view, it unfolded slowly, piece by piece, as if revealing itself reluctantly. The land stretched farther than Daniel could see at first glance, rolling fields divided by long fences that vanished into the distance. Several large barns stood apart from one another, weathered wood darkened by time, roofs patched and repatched over the years. Beyond them, pastures opened wide, dotted with cattle that barely reacted to the truck's approach. The main house sat farther back, a large farmhouse with peeling white paint and windows that reflected the sky without revealing anything inside. Daniel felt something tighten in his chest. Not fear exactly, but the awareness that he had arrived somewhere that did not care whether he stayed or left. He was shown his room in a smaller building behind the main house, a converted bunkhouse that smelled faintly of dust and hay. It was simple but clean. A bed, a dresser, a small window facing the fields. Another bed stood opposite his, already occupied. That was how he met Aaron. Aaron was younger than Daniel by a few years, lean, quiet, with the kind of tired eyes that suggested he had been running from something too. He had arrived 2 weeks earlier from Ohio after his own job fell through. Their introduction was awkward but polite, the shared understanding of two men starting over without needing to say it aloud. Over the next few days, routines settled in quickly. They woke before sunrise, fed the cattle, checked fences, cleaned stalls, rotated grazing areas. The work was hard, but honest, repetitive enough to quiet Daniel's thoughts. The farm was larger than he first realized, spanning hundreds of acres divided into sections with subtle differences in soil and grass. Some fields were lush and green, others darker, heavier, the earth holding moisture longer than it should. The animals were healthy overall. Cows, a small number of horses, a few goats kept near the barns. They followed patterns, ate when fed, moved as expected. Still, Daniel noticed how the land seemed to swallow sound. Even during the busiest parts of the day, there was a strange muffling to everything, as if the fields absorbed noise rather than reflected it. Aaron noticed it too, though neither of them mentioned it at first. They learned the rhythms of the place together, sharing meals in the evenings, swapping pieces of their pasts without digging too deep. Aaron joked about the isolation, said it felt like the end of the world out here, but his laughter never quite reached his eyes. They grew comfortable with one another quickly, the kind of forced closeness that comes from shared labor and shared silence. Walter, the owner, appeared only occasionally. He gave instructions when needed, corrected mistakes without anger, but never lingered. He watched more than he spoke. When he did talk, it was about the work, never about the land itself. Daniel asked once how long the farm had been in his family. Walter answered without looking at him, "Long enough." Nights were quiet in a way Daniel had never experienced before. No distant traffic, no sirens, just wind moving through grass and the occasional lowing of cattle far off in the dark. Sometimes Daniel lay awake listening, trying to identify sounds, unsure why the silence unsettled him more than noise ever had. Aaron admitted one night that he found it hard to sleep too, though he couldn't explain why. "Feels like something's always about to happen," he said, then laughed it off. The days passed smoothly, almost too smoothly. By the end of the first few weeks, Daniel realized he hadn't thought about his old life in days. The farm demanded presence. It kept him grounded in his body, in his hands, in the immediate needs of living things. If there was anything wrong beneath the surface, it hadn't shown itself yet. And if the land was watching them, learning them, neither man noticed. Not then. They woke before sunrise, fed the cattle, checked fences, cleaned stalls, rotated grazing areas. The work was hard, but honest, repetitive enough to quiet Daniel's thoughts. The farm was larger than he first realized, spanning hundreds of acres divided into sections with subtle differences in soil and grass. Some fields were lush and green, others darker, heavier, the earth holding moisture longer than it should. The animals were healthy overall. Cows, a small number of horses, a few goats kept near the barns. They followed patterns, ate when fed, moved as expected. Still, Daniel noticed how the land seemed to swallow sound. Even during the busiest parts of the day, there was a strange muffling to everything, as if the fields absorbed noise rather than reflected it. Aaron noticed it too, though neither of them mentioned it at first. They learned the rhythms of the place together, sharing meals in the evenings, swapping pieces of their pasts without digging too deep. Aaron joked about the isolation, said it felt like the end of the world out here, but his laughter never quite reached his eyes. They grew comfortable with one another quickly, the kind of forced closeness that comes from shared labor and shared silence. Walter, the owner, appeared only occasionally. He gave instructions when needed, corrected mistakes without anger, but never lingered. He watched more than he spoke. When he did talk, it was about the work, never about the land itself. Daniel asked once how long the farm had been in his family. Walter answered without looking at him. "Long enough." Nights were quiet in a way Daniel had never experienced before. No distant traffic, no sirens, just wind moving through grass and the occasional lowing of cattle far off in the dark. Sometimes Daniel lay awake listening, trying to identify sounds, unsure why the silence unsettled him more than noise ever had. Aaron admitted one night that he found it hard to sleep too, though he couldn't explain why. "Feels like something's always about to happen," he said, then laughed it off. The days passed smoothly, almost too smoothly. By the end of the first few weeks, Daniel realized he hadn't thought about his old life in days. The farm demanded presence. It kept him grounded in his body, in his hands, in the immediate needs of living things. If there was anything wrong beneath the surface, it hadn't shown itself yet. And if the land was watching them, learning them, neither man noticed. Not then. It began with behavior that was easy to dismiss. Cows standing still longer than usual before feeding. Horses stopping short at invisible lines and shifting their weight as if testing the air itself. Goats that normally scattered at the sound of footsteps instead watched silently, eyes following Daniel and Aaron until they passed out of view. Daniel noticed these things but kept to himself at first. Farms were living systems. Animals reacted to pressure, to weather, to scents humans couldn't detect. There were reasonable explanations for everything, and he clung to them because the alternative required questions he wasn't ready to ask. Aaron noticed too. One evening, while repairing a section of fence near the northern fields, he mentioned how quiet the cows had become. Not calm, quiet. They no longer lowed at feeding time. They moved when directed, but without impatience or sound. Daniel lit off, though unease stirred beneath the gesture. Nights had changed as well. The darkness felt heavier, not because anything happened in it, but because so little did. Insects fell silent earlier. Wind died abruptly instead of fading gradually. Sometimes Daniel woke convinced he had heard movement outside, only to find nothing disturbed when he checked in the morning. The land held its stillness too perfectly. The first death came without warning. It was early, fog still clinging to the lower ground, when Daniel found the cow in the eastern pasture. She lay on her side, legs tucked as if she had simply folded in on herself. There were no signs of struggle, no damage to the fence, no tracks leading toward or away from her. He knelt beside her and touched her neck, expecting warmth. The cold shocked him. Not the gradual chill of an animal dead overnight, but a deep, settled cold that felt out of place in the mild air. Her eyes were open, glassy, fixed on nothing. Aaron arrived a moment later and stopped short when he saw her. He didn't speak at first. Neither of them did. They walked the pasture together, checking the rest of the herd. Every other cow stood breathing, watching, their bodies angled subtly toward the darker stretch of land farther north. Walter came later in the morning. He listened as Daniel explained, asked a few questions, then stood over the body longer than either man was comfortable with. He never touched it, never knelt. When he finally spoke, his voice was even, practiced. He said stress, he said sudden failure. He said these things happened, but his eyes never left the field. They buried the cow near the edge of the pasture, where the soil gave way too easily beneath the shovel. That night, the animals refused to settle. They clustered together, standing instead of lying down, heads turned in the same direction as if listening for something that had not yet arrived. Daniel watched them from the fence line until darkness swallowed their shapes. Sleep came late and shallow. In the morning, work continued. It always did, but something had shifted. The farm no longer felt neutral, it felt attentive, and though neither man said it aloud, both understood that what had happened was not finished. The second month began under the illusion that nothing fundamental had changed, but the farm no longer moved the same way it once had. Daniel felt it in the mornings, in the hesitation before stepping out of the bunkhouse, in the way the air seemed heavier even on clear days. Work still needed to be done, and so it was, but each task carried a quiet tension now, as if the land itself were waiting to see how they would respond. The animals remained alive, breathing, eating, but they behaved like creatures that no longer trusted daylight to protect them. Cattle gathered closer together than before, their bodies forming dense clusters in the fields. Horses refused to separate, following one another with anxious persistence. Even the goats, once chaotic and loud, moved cautiously, staying near solid structures as if walls could offer safety from something unseen. Daniel and Aaron spoke about it in fragments, half-sentences exchanged during work, neither wanting to frame their observations as fear. They told each other it was temporary, that animals reacted to loss the same way people did, through changes in behavior that meant nothing in the long run. But then, the second death came, and with it, the collapse of those explanations. It happened 3 nights after the burial. A younger cow this time, strong, healthy, found near the far fence of the southern pasture. Again, no blood, no broken bones, no sign of illness. Her body lay stiff, angled toward the same northern stretch of land the others watched. The vet arrived later that day, drove slowly through the fields, examined the carcass with professional detachment, and left with no answers. Sudden cardiac failure, he said. Rare, but possible. Daniel watched Walter during the examination. The older man stood farther back than necessary, arms folded tight across his chest, jaw clenched hard enough to ache. When the vet drove away, Walter said nothing. He simply walked back toward the house without looking at either worker. The deaths continued, spaced just far enough apart to make each one feel isolated, accidental, almost explainable. Another cow a week later, then a horse. That one shook Aaron badly. The horse had been his responsibility, a calm animal that trusted him completely. He found it in the stable before dawn, standing upright but unmoving, eyes wide, breath absent. It had died on its feet. After that, Aaron stopped sleeping through the night. Daniel could hear him pacing, could hear him sit up abruptly as if startled awake by sounds Daniel himself could not hear. The farm changed with each death. The air felt denser, carrying a faint smell that Daniel could never quite identify, something between damp soil and cold metal. Fog became a regular presence, settling low over the fields at night and lingering well into the morning. The animals reacted to it immediately, pulling back from pasture edges, refusing to enter certain areas entirely. Daniel marked the places they avoided, noting how the boundaries shifted gradually, inching closer to the barns and living quarters. Walter finally addressed them after the 4th death. He gathered them in the equipment shed, his voice low, controlled, too careful. He told them the losses were unfortunate but manageable. He told them not to wander at night, not to interfere with animals acting strangely, not to follow them if they moved on their own. When Daniel asked why, Walter's expression hardened. "Because you won't help," he said. That answer sat poorly with both men. They began to work closer together, rarely separating for long. The farm, once expansive, now felt restrictive, its wide fields offering no comfort. Sounds traveled oddly. Sometimes a gate slammed without wind. Sometimes footsteps echoed where no one stood. One evening, while checking the northern fence line from a distance, Daniel noticed that the grass there lay flattened in long arcs, as if something heavy had passed through repeatedly, circling rather than crossing. He didn't tell Aaron. He didn't tell Walter. He wasn't sure why. Perhaps some part of him hoped that by keeping the knowledge contained, it would lose its power. The next death happened in broad daylight. A cow collapsed while grazing, legs folding beneath her as if the ground itself had failed. Daniel and Aaron watched helplessly as her breathing slowed, then stopped. No struggle, no sound. The rest of the herd backed away in perfect unison, creating a wide, empty ring around the body. That was when Daniel understood that whatever was happening was no longer confined to night. The farm no longer waited for darkness. That evening, neither man ate. They sat in silence to the wind scrape against the buildings, watching shadows stretch unnaturally across the yard as the sun set. Walter did not join them. Lights burned late in the main house. Somewhere beyond the fields, something moved, slow and deliberate, unseen but unmistakably present. And the farm, patient and enduring, allowed it to continue. By the time the fifth death occurred, denial was no longer an option. The farm had crossed a threshold neither Daniel nor Aaron could clearly define, but both felt it in their bodies the same way animals sense an approaching storm. Work continued because stopping felt more dangerous than moving forward, but every task was performed with heightened awareness, every sound examined for meaning. They no longer joked. They no longer filled silence with small talk. Instead, they listened. They watched. The animals dictated the pace now. If cattle refused a pasture, it remained empty. If horses balked at a path, it was avoided. The land was shrinking, not physically, but in terms of where life seemed willing to exist. Fog became a constant presence, rolling in earlier each evening, thick enough to dull sound and distort distance. Daniel noticed how it clung to certain areas longer than others, especially the northern fields. Even on bright mornings, that section of land appeared muted, colors flattened, edges less defined, as if reality itself thinned there. Aaron began keeping notes, scribbling observations in a small notebook he carried everywhere. Times, locations, animal behavior, patterns he hoped would reveal logic. He never shared the notebook's contents unless asked, and even then he summarized instead of reading directly from it, as if the written words held weight of their own. Walter grew more distant. Days passed without seeing him at all. When he did appear, his eyes were sunken, his movements stiff, his attention divided between the workers and something farther out in the fields. He reinforced his earlier instructions, warned them again not to approach animals acting strangely, not to go out at night unless absolutely necessary. Daniel asked him directly what was happening. Walter's response was immediate and sharp. "This land doesn't tolerate curiosity," he said. That was the first time either man heard fear in his voice. The fifth death was a horse. Not Aaron's, but one that had been there long before either of them arrived. It was found near the boundary of the northern pasture, collapsed mid-stride, neck twisted at an unnatural angle that suggested panic without violence. The fence nearby remained untouched. No broken boards, no tracks, just deep impressions in the grass forming a wide curve around the body, as if something had circled it repeatedly before the moment of death. That night, Daniel dreamed of standing in the field, fog closing in around his legs while something moved just beyond sight, its presence marked only by the way the grass bowed away from it. He woke, drenched in sweat, heart racing, convinced for several long seconds that he was still there. Aaron admitted the next morning that he had dreamed the same thing. They didn't discuss how impossible that was. The animals stopped vocalizing altogether. Feeding time passed in silence, broken only by the sound of hooves and machinery. Birds avoided the fields entirely. Even insects seemed scarce. The absence of noise pressed down harder than any scream could have. Daniel began to feel watched during the day, not in a paranoid way, but with the steady certainty of being observed by something patient and calculating. Shadows appeared where none should exist. Fences creaked without wind. Once, while repairing a gate, Daniel heard footsteps behind him and turned to find nothing there, the grass unmarked, the air still. Aaron grew restless, pacing at night, muttering to himself. He spoke of leaving, of finding another job, of warning someone, anyone. But each time he talked seriously about it, something intervened. A sudden storm, a truck that refused to start, a call from Walter reminding them of responsibilities that could not be abandoned. It felt less like coincidence and more like resistance. The sixth death came suddenly and violently by comparison, though still without visible cause. 2 cows collapsed within minutes of each other in adjacent fields, their bodies angled toward the same point near the northern boundary. Daniel and Aaron stood frozen, unable to help, unable to look away. The ground beneath their feet vibrated faintly, not enough to be felt physically, but enough to register as wrong, like pressure building deep underground. That was when Daniel realized the farm was not the stage for these events. It was part of them. Whatever lived there did not simply inhabit the land. It used it, fed through it. The fences, the fields, the animals were extensions of something larger, something that had learned the rhythms of life and death and applied them with precision. That evening, Walter finally spoke openly, though not fully. He told them the farm had been losing animals for decades, always in cycles, always accelerating once it began. He said leaving early never helped, that the land remembered who worked it, who depended on it. He did not explain how he knew this. He did not explain why he stayed. His final warning was quiet and absolute. "It takes what notices it," he said. Night fell heavy and suffocating. Fog swallowed the yard entirely, reducing the world to a few feet of visibility. From somewhere deep in the fields came a sound Daniel could not identify, low and resonant, like the earth itself shifting position. The animals did not move. They stood rigid, facing outward, forming a silent perimeter. And for the first time since arriving, Daniel understood that the farm was no longer testing them. It had decided. The night after Walter spoke, sleep became impossible. Daniel lay rigid, every creak of the bunkhouse amplified. Aaron sat listening, notebook abandoned. Outside, fog pressed against the windows, thick and suffocating, carrying a low, pulsing presence that pressed behind the eyes and along the spine. Morning revealed stillness. Cattle remained frozen in the northern fields. Horses refused to leave their stalls. Halfway through the pasture, the ground beneath them felt dense, alive. A deep vibration ran through the land. Then the animals moved, slow, ignoring calls and fences. One by one, they collapsed in the northern pasture where the grass lay pressed in spirals, fog swirling inward unnaturally. The ground trembled. In the mist, a distortion bent space, feeding on attention itself. Walter appeared, warnings. Daniel felt thoughts brushed against, measured, catalogued. The land had trapped them, slowly embedding those who worked it. Walter urged them to run. They fled until trees swallowed the farm and the pressure eased. Sun rose weakly, sirens approached. The owner was gone, Aaron disappeared, and Daniel carried the farm with him, its fog, its hostility, its faint vibrations, knowing it waited for the next cycle.